Day 794 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So, starting off, we'll take a look at the Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 466,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 1,096 in the past day. And as you can see, it's a number now marked with additional specificity after a refinement on calculations by the General Staff of the AFU. Then, as for hardware losses, 11 tanks, 20 APVs, and a whopping 43 artillery. Then heading across to the map, as Ukrainian forces launched a daring strike on the Kashevskaya military airbase in Russia's Krasnodar region over the weekend, with the attack carried out by the Security Service of Ukraine and Defense Forces, targeting the airfield where dozens of military aircraft, radars, and electronic warfare devices were stationed. One-way UAV drones hit a warehouse storing control and correction modules for Russian aerial glide munitions, also known as the UMPK glide modules, at the airbase. Photos and videos from the scenes showed flanker jets near the site, but it remains unknown if any aircraft were damaged. And we were also able to see examples of those UMPK kits in the wreckage, all of which clearly makes for a very targeted approach to key strategic military sites and assets within Russia. Then, within the same night, the SBU also conducted drone strikes against the Ilsky and Slavyansk oil refineries in the Krasnodar Krai region. The attacks caused fires and evacuation of personnel, damaging key technological objects at the facilities. A bitumen factory and other infrastructure were also targeted. Now, Russian authorities claim to have shot down 66 drones during these strikes, also stating that there was no serious damage. Such an a la carte response, as they seem to try to somehow attempt to play down these events once again. Other reports suggested that 10 drones hit the oil refinery plant targets, causing a strong fire and potentially further hidden damage as well. A distillation tower was also reportedly hit. Plus, we've now seen that homemade protection style apparatus against Ukrainian drones has begun to be installed at least one Russian oil depot. Behold, the oil depot cope cage. Russia, from Kyiv in 3 days to cope cages on oil depots. And just to note, this type of setup might have some lucky success against a single FPV drone, but of course those tiny short-range drones are not used on Russian targets inside of Russia. Instead, Russia is dealing with larger drones, sometimes the size of a Cessna, not to mention a much larger payload, with, for instance, fragmentation munitions and many more than one. So I think the real question Russia needs to ask itself here is, why aren't their air defenses working? But of course, the answer is they're too few and far between, with limited numbers trying to protect so many other sites that need protection within Russia. But of course, they're also dispersed inside of Russian-controlled Ukraine, which, by the way, are getting destroyed every week and sometimes every single day, as they're dealing with a lot of attrition on that front. And it was just near the end of my last video upload that I had a strong feeling about some notable events playing out over the weekend, and not because of some crystal ball, but rather just because it seemed logical that Ukraine would then continue its fairly sustained campaign on targeting Russian sites, at least as an indirect follow-up to last week's supportive aid bill that passed in the US. And though these were homegrown Ukrainian UAVs used in these strikes, it simply comes amid the backdrop of a further continued show of support from the West. Then moving along on the map, because that's not all for Russia, because Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence claimed responsibility for the destruction of a Russian Ka-32 multi-role helicopter at an airfield just south of the Moscow capital. The agency released footage showing partisan or spy-related activity of the event that caused the destruction of the helicopter, which was reportedly used by the Russian Defense Ministry to support occupation forces. Then, as for an update from prior events, as we now see released satellite images revealing the extent of damage to the Smolensk oil depot in Russia, which was struck by a Ukrainian drone or set of drones in the early hours of April 24, a few days ago. The higher resolution pictures show that at least 8 fuel storage tanks have been completely destroyed in the strike, with the affected segment likely rendered inoperable due to the extensive damage. Then headed across to the Ukrainian map today, as there has been slight positional changes here and there in the east, but there has been indisputable instances of the Russian forces capturing the land between Novobakhmutivka and Berdichi on the Avdiivka axis, in what would be perhaps the biggest single windfall of a capture for the Russian forces that I've seen in quite some time now. And so going back on the date map, I'll show you what it looked like as there we go. So 2 points have changed there in the last 2 days, where you may remember the grey zone encirclement situation at play just before the weekend, where it was indicated that the Russian army in the region was determined to close the gap. As such, Ukrainian forces have indeed needed to retreat from those positions specifically because there was just no way to maintain them without getting decimated in the process. Then also, heavy fighting continues near to the railway as Ukrainian forces are attempting to drive out Russian troops from Osheretino. The Russian Federation has deployed 4 brigades in the area, prompting Ukraine to pull up additional means and forces from their reserves. And as it so happens, the AFU is taking decisive measures to recapture the settlement, engaging in fierce combat against the entrenched Russian forces now. Then moving more north on the map with Chasiv Yar, the Chasiv Yar axis, which has been unexpectedly quite stable in the meanwhile. Although we have seen the Russian forces pull up a lot of their available SPGs in the region, like this 152mm Akatsiya in Bakhmut, which was then taken out by a Ukrainian artillery brigade. Although Russia definitely still has Chasiv Yar in its sights, without a doubt, with about 20,000 Russian troops in the region to support their offensive efforts. Although topographically, it does have the hills and the Seversky Canal providing natural defense structures for the Ukrainian forces. But in the end, Russia is still aiming to seize it before the May 9th Russian military parade holiday. Then somewhere in the east, we saw a destroyed Russian T-90M tank. This was somewhere in the Donetsk Oblast. And the cope cage, as you can see there, was clearly destroyed by some type of Ukrainian fire, possibly from 1 or 2 RPG rounds delivered by an FPV. Then, also somewhere in the east, Ukraine's military intelligence reported a hit on a Russian radar system worth about $5 million. As the HUR, in combination with the 15th Separate Artillery Reconnaissance Brigade, struck a Russian Podlet K1 radar station. And specifically, these radars are designed to detect air targets at low and extremely low altitudes. The system is also designed to be used by Russian forces to detect and transmit target coordinates to the Russian S-300 and S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems. Therefore, it's quite the win to remove one of these from the battlefield. Then headed a bit further south on the map as powerful explosions were heard again in the Jankoy region of the Crimean Peninsula, with also Ukrainian missile attacks ongoing against Russian installations in western Crimea. Specifically, Russian telegrammer Rybar reported that ATACMS missiles were used on the Western Cape, stating that a cluster round as opposed to a unitary warhead as being used. And of course, you might guess the target was Russian air defense systems, which have at this location been successfully targeted before. Also note that this map makes it look like the ATACMS missiles cannot reach all of the Crimean Peninsula, but that's actually not the case. But rather, it's only from deploying ATACMS or their HIMARS launchers in Odessa, which has its range limitations on that front. Otherwise, there are multiple points on the map that provides Ukraine with full access to all of Crimea, including the bridge. And particularly, Zaporizhia, which is the position where Ukrainian ATACMS missiles can easily reach that 300 kilometer mark, up to around there. Then headed across to some news updates, as Italy has secretly provided Ukraine with a number of undisclosed Storm Shadow missiles, as revealed by Grant Shapps, who is the Secretary of State for Defense of the United Kingdom. The Italian government has consistently kept its military aid to Ukraine confidential, although in this case, the long-range cruise missiles have reportedly been sent to Ukraine in a joint effort with France. So this recent revelation highlights the ongoing, albeit discreet, support from Western allies like Italy and France, alongside the UK of course, in bolstering Ukraine's defense capabilities with the Storm Shadows or the Scalp missiles. Then in some other hardware-related news, Kazakhstan, a former Soviet ally, has sold 81 Soviet-made military aircraft to the United States through offshore companies, just a couple of days ago on April 26th, according to a number of media reports now. The deal included MiG-29s, MiG-27s, and Su-24 fighter jets, which tends to certainly suggest that a move like this means that Kazakhstan is turning its back on Russia and aligning itself more closely with Western interests. Now, specifically, the sale of these aircraft to the US raises questions about their ultimate destination, with speculation that they may very likely be intended for Ukraine. Although it is expected that a lot of these jets would be used for parts, with just a small number being operational. But the price tag they got it for a real steal. So this reported sale also highlights the shifting geopolitical landscape in the post-Soviet space, with former Russian allies like Kazakhstan increasingly seeking to distance themselves from Moscow's influence and forge closer ties with the West. And it's not surprising, given that there was a piece of leaked Russian audio some weeks back now from members of the Russian parliament suggesting that Kazakhstan could be next after Ukraine, as it would relate to some form of military conflict. Then in some more news, the head of Russian Karela, which is a northwest region of Russia, has proposed paying female students 100,000 rubles, so approximately $1,000, for having their first child before the age of 25. The region's head argued that the earlier women start having children, the more likely they are to have large families. And so this suggestion is seen as a response to President Putin's call for Russian families to have more children. Although recently Putin had lowered the target from suggesting Russian women have 8 children down to a possibly more realistic 3 children per family, with the ultimate goal of this proposed financial incentive as an attempt to boost the country's birth rate. Although many critics have argued that this initiative is primarily aimed at providing cannon fodder for Putin's military ambitions, as a larger population would mean more potential recruits for the Russian armed forces, later down the track of course. So as Russia grapples with demographic challenges posed by an aging population and low birth rates, and the war in Ukraine, it seems like Russian political figures are ready to pull out all the stops, except of course to stop their cannon fodder approach to their war that exists in their invasion of their next door neighbor. Anything but, hey? Then moving across to the quickest of Russian military mobilization blunder segments that I have ever done, because I found this image online, date and time unknown, but it just happens to be almost exactly how I have envisaged how the Russian MOD rounds up cannon fodder troops for the front lines like cattle, except without the side holes for fresh air. Possibly with a couple of armed guards thrown into the mix there as well, so that nobody gets the idea to jump out the top. Then headed across to a quick funny to round it all off with today, guys. So, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, who currently serves as the Deputy Chairman of the Security Council of Russia, keeps us all on our toes with his endless supply of creative zingers. Because most recently, Medvedev has expressed that Russia may confiscate private US assets in response to the US potentially seizing Russian sovereign assets. The only problem is, Russia has long been a place of capital outflows and not so much inflows. Hence the 300 billion worth of frozen assets held outside of Russia. But as a result, and after Medvedev kind of realized this, he then, in a later response to save face, stated that since there's not much to take, he might instead seek to target private property owners with US citizenship inside of Russia and any other assets that they may have. But then he went on to state that some sort of legal or other economic difficulty is involved in performing this type of process, due to the complicated nature of how such individuals are usually investors within the Russian economy, which would then create a backfiring negative effect. Not much of a threat, really. A little bit sad, in fact. He should have started there many, many moons ago, then worked his way up to the previous 17 nuclear threats that he made. Not the other way around. Gee. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like and comment. Thanks again for all of your support, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.